I happen to be someone who really prioritizes sex and pleasure in my life. And so I will block off 4 or 5 or 6 hours or a weekend for just like sex and connection with my partner.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. The relationship between cannabis and sexuality certainly reaches far back into human history. I had a lot of trouble even trying to decide which of the anecdotes from my archives to include in this introduction to sex and cannabis. A favorite is that in old Egypt, they made a candy called crocodile's penis. It was a hash confection with a pinch of crocodile's member to enhance aphrodisiac effects. In the ancient Kamadeva love festival of India, the many participants would be drinking bhang, which is a hashish lassi kind of drink, to generate amorous feelings. And it's well known among bird breeders that hemp seeds are just the thing to make your pigeons and canaries fuck more. In fact, when Harry Anslinger slipped the Marijuana Tax Act into law in 1937, the bird food manufacturers made him carve out an exception for sterilized hemp seeds to keep their birds breeding. Then, in 1970, Harry Anslinger was still on his reefer madness propaganda and was talking to Playboy about an incident that I guess he thought was bad. He said to them, "There isn't any question about marijuana being a sexual stimulant. A classic example of amatory activities is contained in the article Hashish Poisoning in England from the London Police Journal of 1934. In this remarkable case, a young man and his girlfriend planted seeds in their backyard, and when the stalks matured, they crushed the flowering tops and smoked one cigarette, and then engaged in such erotic activities that the neighbors called the police and they were taken to jail. Sex so good, they called the cops. Oh, the horror." Recent research has even found an inverse ratio between the amount a couple consumes cannabis and the incidence of domestic violence. And I'll link to that study in the episode notes. Timothy Leary, always one to bang the brass band about sex and drugs, said, "It's true that marijuana is a fantastically effective aphrodisiac, and the person who understands pot can weave together a symphony of visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and tactical sensitivity to make lovemaking an adventure which dwarfs the imagination of the pornographers." From that same time period, the great poetess Lenore Candell wrote her poem, The Potbird Story, which is a special treat I read and attached to the end of this episode. So stick around. Another great female voice, Patti Smith, said, "I think sex is one of the 5 highest senses one can experience. A very high orgasm is a way of communicating with our Creator." And I first heard that Patti Smith quote from my friend Betty Dodson, the mother of masturbation in America and still one of those radicals teaching sexuality to females and praising cannabis for sexual health. She said, "You can't underestimate the healing power of an orgasm." With that long, vivid history in mind, you can see why I'm glad to welcome Ashley Manta to the show. She is a sexual educator who's become an expert in the use of cannabis for intimacy and relationships. She coined the term cannasexual to describe anyone who mindfully and deliberately combines sex and cannabis. She'll talk about the story of what brought her to this intriguing intersection, and you can learn much more on her website, where she includes links to her many, many dozens of well-written articles she's produced on the subject. Ashley leads retreats, she teaches at conferences, and she was nominated for Sexpert of the Year by the 2018 XBiz Awards. I'll include a link to some of my favorite articles by her in the episode notes, but I encourage you to keep following Ashley's work. She's one of the most well-spoken guests I've ever interviewed, and it's a pleasure to present her thoughts on cannasexuality. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, I am here with Ashley Manta, and she coined the term cannasexual. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And before we get into your work with cannabis and sexuality, how was it that you got into each of these fields and combined them?
I have been a sexuality educator for 10 years, and I got my start doing that as a sexual violence prevention educator and a rape crisis counselor. And the way I came to that is that I'm a sexual assault survivor. I was raped when I was 13, and I told my story for the first time at a Take Back the Night rally my first year of college. And I realized that by telling my story, it gave me an opportunity to reclaim my narrative in a really powerful way. And I wanted to understand how that worked. I wanted to understand what my brain was doing, how my body was reacting. Like, I wanted to kind of hack trauma, if I could, as a way of coping with it. And it turns out it doesn't quite work that way, but it was really useful for me to learn about all sorts of different ancillary modalities for healing trauma in addition to just traditional talk therapy. And so I looked into art therapy and music therapy and body movement, and all of those things were really useful. And I was working as a victim advocate and doing a lot of work to try to prevent this from happening to other people. And in those kinds of direct service jobs, it's very high burnout work. And I burned out. That's the thing that happens. And so I decided to kind of pivot to the more pleasure-focused aspects of sexuality. Consent, body confidence, destigmatizing STIs, shame busting, like all of those kinds of things, learning about toys and lubes and the things that bring our bodies pleasure. And all of this was still happening in Pennsylvania, which is a prohibition state. And so I didn't have access to good, high quality cannabis. In Pennsylvania, there's sort of like weed and no weed. Those are your options. You don't have strains, you don't have products, you don't have any choice. It's just whatever your dealer happens to have. And so when I moved to California in 2013, it was the first time I tried medical cannabis. And I was really blown away by the difference between, the oregano looking stuff that I was getting in baggies in Pennsylvania versus like these beautiful trichome covered buds in California that were just beautiful and effective, like very potent and very specific in their effects. So that was when I started to be like, this is something that could be useful and helpful. And around the same time, around 2014, I found Foria, which is a THC infused coconut oil that's designed for genitals. And it's actually designed to decrease discomfort and increase pleasure. And that was the first time I'd ever seen a company market a cannabis product specifically for sex. And I realized that there weren't really any sex educators in my community of professionals talking about cannabis. And so I was like, well, that could be a really interesting niche for me. And I decided to start focusing on it.
Wow, what a story. So it feels very natural, in fact.
Yes, it was definitely a natural progression. And I did find cannabis to be incredibly helpful in managing my PTSD symptoms, anxiety attacks, feeling really dissociated from my body, not being interested in sex, not having much of an appetite. When I get stressed, my appetite's the first thing to go. And so actually having something that would stimulate me to eat as opposed to just like stare listlessly at food for days on end was really useful.
Was it a struggle to figure out how to use cannabis? Which different strains or which different ingestion methods worked for you for the various things you were trying to do and heal?
I wouldn't say that it was a struggle, but it was definitely a time-consuming and very intentional process. It wasn't enough to just have cannabis. Like, I couldn't just take a random joint from someone or take a dab. Like, I had to be really choosy about what I was trying to accomplish when I was consuming that particular product or strain. And I realized that other people's recommendations weren't necessarily useful for me. Like someone was like, oh my God, you got to try sour diesel. It's so great. Like when you're not motivated and you need to get stuff done. And so I tried sour diesel and it gave me a panic attack. So I was like, okay, now I realize that like each person's experience with cannabis is pretty unique based on their body chemistry, metabolism, tolerance, not to mention like mindset and setting, which you hear people talk about set and setting all the time in cannabis use and all sorts of substances. So it makes sense that it would translate for cannabis, that you really need to try things in small amounts on your own to figure out how they work for you rather than taking the suggestions of others.
And so what's it like to be an educator around this when I would guess that a lot of people simply want an answer? Okay, you do this like this, and then all of a sudden the explosion goes better like this.
People definitely would really like the kind of tab A, slot B style answers of like, oh yeah, you just do this, and then that happens. And unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. Everything is nuanced, everything is complicated, and everything exists on a spectrum. So having 2 degrees in philosophy, I'm very used to like getting people off of the easy answers train and like redirecting them towards, okay, no, actually this is going to require some like conditions and qualifying before I can give you an answer. And so sometimes people are disappointed, or they're like, oh, well, this is a cop-out. Like, you're not really giving me answers. And what I'm actually really trying to do is empower them to find the answers for themselves.
And what are some of the things that surprise people coming to you the most as they're learning about cannabis and sexuality?
The most common thing that people are surprised about is that you don't have to be high to enjoy the benefits of cannabis. Those 2 things have been really conflated in our culture. Because of, smear campaigns from the government and the whole reefer madness, as well as like media stereotypes about what a cannabis consumer looks like and what a cannabis consumption experience feels like. But especially for folks who are new, like I really want them to understand that you don't have to be high to get the benefits of this plant. There are topical applications. There are strains and products that don't actually have psychoactive effects, whether they're like high in CBD, or they are from THCA, which is the acid form of THC that doesn't have psychoactive effects. The psychoactive version of THC is delta-9 THC, and THCA is before it gets heated. So you can consume that in a smoothie or an energy drink or anything like typical consumption. You can juice it. You can juice the cannabis leaves and get THCA that's really good for your body that doesn't get you high.
Do you have a general pattern you recommend to people who want to be exploring this for the first time, and advice about the different ingestion methods and where to be cautious and the strengths and weaknesses of each?
Sure, absolutely. My first recommendation for folks is start with topicals. Topicals are such a really easy, accessible way to start, whether that's using a balm or a salve like on sore muscles or on your temples if you have a headache. If you're taking an infused bath, you can drop a 25 or 50 milligram bath bomb into your tub and you're not going to get high. Like you could take a bath in straight THC and you still wouldn't get high. So it's a really like accessible way to try cannabis that's not scary for people. It can feel like a wellness practice. So that's where I like to get people kind of in on the ground floor. And then for psychoactive methods, inhalables are a good place to start. It's easier to measure dosing and the timing is not a huge time commitment, as opposed to something like edibles, where you have to wait up to 2 full hours for the edible to kick in at all. It's very, very easy to overconsume with edibles. And then the high is going to last anywhere from like 5 to 7 hours, depending on your tolerance. So that's a big time commitment for most people, especially folks who are new. And edibles tend to be the things when I'm talking to folks that everyone has a bad edibles experience. Like that one time they tried their friend's brownie and like woke up the next day and couldn't feel their face. And it was just a mess.
Yeah, they are where the danger is, unfortunately. And they can be so lovely when done correctly, but it's, it can be very traumatic, especially for someone of an older generation to get way too high. Then they're never going to try this again, which is too bad.
That's exactly it. Like, I don't want anyone to push back from the table because they had one really bad experience. And so having a lot of mindfulness around consumption and people being clear about dosage. Like I just read an article on wired.com about some party in New York where they were serving cannabis without being clear on what the milligrams were per serving. Like they said infused, but they weren't clear on what it was infused with. And people were getting like uncomfortably high. and we're upset because like you're essentially drugging people if you're not clear with them on what you're giving them, and that's not cool, like from a consent and body autonomy perspective. So like it's really important for people who are distributing cannabis to be like, okay, this is how many milligrams this has. How often are you smoking? What's your tolerance like? What kind of time commitment do you have? You know, for events and things, a milligram or two, like no more than 5 is plenty for most people. And a lot of times people are like, oh, it's low dose, it's 10 milligrams. Like 10 milligrams will knock a newbie on their ass. So I get a little ferocious about people being irresponsible with serving cannabis, especially to folks who are new to it.
And about communication and cannabis, what do you advise to couples or to partnerships who are looking, to set clear, to talk about this before they use it? What are the questions and things to discuss?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, the first thing is to talk about it before you use it. My adage is negotiate before you medicate. And I think people should be negotiating sex full stop, like across the board, whether they're using cannabis or not, saying what is on the table and what they're in the mood for. But especially when you're introducing an element that could have psychoactive effects depending on the method of consumption, I think it's especially important to be like, okay, so how are you feeling? What do you want to be feeling? And which strains or products are going to help you get there? That's like question number 1. What's on the table for tonight? Are you feeling like you want it to be like high energy, frenzied, lustful, like pounding kind of fucking? Or are you looking for more like slow, sensual, lovemaky? Do you want penetrative sex, or do you just want making out? Or do you just want oral? Or do you just want toys? Like, there's such a wide variety of options when it comes to sexual play with a partner. And we have this very linear, what I call the escalator model of sexuality, where like it's kissing and then it's groping and then it's genitals and then it's oral and then it's intercourse in some fashion and then someone orgasms and then it's generally over. And while that's fine, it's not the only option. And so I really encourage people to do it like they're ordering a pizza, like figure out what you're in the mood for that night and choose those things, and also be really clear on how to know when you're done. Are you going to tap out? Are you going to just say, hey, I'm full. That was great. I feel complete with all of this. Are you going to be like, hey, I'm tired. Let's go to bed. Like, figure out your exit strategy. That's really important.
Around the cannabis specifically, do you have any recommendations for if people get too high, or if boundaries become blurred?
If people get too high, I definitely would say communicate that to your partner in some fashion and have established how to communicate that in advance. Like whether that looks like, timeout sign if they can't quite get their words out, or like tapping, like some way of acknowledging like, I'm not feeling really good right now. And getting that across to the partner, and have the partner really on board with like taking care of the person as opposed to like pushing ahead on their own agenda. That's why it's really important for me when people are combining any substance with sex that they have someone that they trust to honor their boundaries. And if you happen to find yourself in a situation where you're feeling too high, there are a couple of things that help. Time, of course, but also water, deep breathing lavender essential oil will help calm you down if you get into that kind of racy, paranoid state. Also, black peppercorns contain a terpene called beta-caryophyllene, which doesn't have any kind of psychoactive effects, but actually helps calm you down. So you can either like inhale black peppercorns or chew on them if that doesn't totally gross you out. CBD will also help counteract the effects of a too intense high. And I've been seeing some research, and so this is, I don't have solid science to back this up yet, but I've heard anecdotally that a dietary supplement called citicoline, Citicholine, will actually help bring you down as well.
Wow. Yeah, I haven't heard the last one, but the rest, I'm very impressed. In fact, a lot of that's from the old like Arab textbooks on how to not be so high. Yeah, you know your stuff.
Thank you.
And what you were saying earlier about types of consent reminded me some old chauvinistic tripper types. The rule was if you put your hand in the air and then say something out loud, that means that this is a very serious thing. I'm not joking that I smell fire or making a joke about something like that. I actually mean I think there's smoke, there's danger, or I'm not feeling well, or to really get across the clarity of the communication.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and certainly something that people could implement, like some kind of code word or signal that, like, no, seriously though, whatever you're about to say.
Some other really good advice I saw in your writing, which is excellent as it is voluminous. It's very impressive, the output and the places you write for. But you were saying about keeping a diary with the different strains that you're using and how you're going about this. And I thought it was a great way to really pay attention to what's working here.
Absolutely. In fact, there have actually been a couple of companies that have come out with pre-printed journals for you to track strains and effects. There's a company called Gold Leaf. I can send you the link if you want to put it in the show notes. They have a patient journal that goes through some really useful, like, evidence-based things to know about cannabis, about cannabinoids beyond just THC and CBD. They talk about CBN and CBG, THCV, like all of the different ones and what they do. And then they go through the terpenes like linalool and pinene and beta-caryophyllene and what they do and at what temperatures they are combusted. So it's really useful if you have like a vaporizer, you can turn it to a specific temperature to target those specific compounds or terpenes, which is really cool. And then you can also like write down, this is where I got it, these were the effects, this is how I felt, would I use this again? And they have like grids that you can draw. It's so deliciously nerdy. I can't get enough of it.
It is. It's two great parts of hacking, like how to take these drugs and how to pleasure another human being. They're so hard and you spend the rest of your life doing them and never quite get it right. And it sounds like a fascinating combination. It's
a lot of fun, and it's a constantly evolving field as products come on the market, as we learn more, as we start to get research and science behind it. I'm actually in the process of developing my own line of products with a compound pharmacist and a PhD chemist and an MD and a sex therapist and me. And like, we're all putting our heads together to really come up with a great product with replicable effects. You know, I don't want it to be just like, oh, well, this works like this for some person, was this for another person. Like, I want them to be precise and so that you know what you're getting every time.
So for the people that you teach in your classes, what kind of feedback do you get, not only about the physical side of how cannabis lube and cannabis products work, but also what people saw in their relationships and emotionally?
Oh my goodness. The messages that I get from people on social media and via email after they've come to my workshops, or even just from following me on Instagram or Twitter, are so powerful. I actually end up like screen capping them and saving them for days that like I'm having a tough time, because people have told me stories about feeling like their sex life is transformed, that they feel comfortable in their body, that they're able to experience pleasure, that they feel more deeply connected with their partners, like really, really overwhelmingly positive feedback that really helps me feel like I'm on the right track.
And what are the biggest concerns that people have? What are the fears that you hear the most often?
One of the biggest fears is, I don't know how to do this. I don't know what products to choose. I don't know how to even get started. And so that's a very common one. Sometimes it's timing. People are like, I have kids. We have different schedules. Like, we barely have time for sex, much less like planning something that's sort of complicated and involved and requires a lot of forethought, which I get. Like, I happen to be someone who really prioritizes sex and pleasure in my life. And so I will block off 4 or 5 or 6 hours or a weekend for just like sex and connection with my partner. I get that not everyone can do that, or not everyone wants to do that. And so when people are like, but timing though, I really encourage them to schedule even small pockets of time to connect with their partners. And that's when like the non-psychoactive methods of consumption can be really useful, or things that don't last very long, like smoking or vaping, are going to have a quicker onset time and a quicker wear off time than something like edibles.
What I like about your approach is you also don't just promote pleasure, but you talk about how this can help ease physical discomfort that might be happening for sex just because of physical reasons, or for helping heal trauma around sex. I mean, how have you seen that, that unfold through the people you work with?
In so many different ways. One of my colleagues is an amazing disability educator and activist named Robin Wilson Beatty, and she has a spinal cord injury, and she talks very openly about using cannabis to help manage her chronic pain, and that really helps her be present during sex. And I was chatting with an MD that we're working with to make these products, and they pointed out something really interesting about chronic pain, which is that often with chronic pain, it's about reduction to a manageable level. It's really not about eliminating pain. Like if you're at a 7 and you can get down to a 3 or a 4, that's a huge difference and like a noticeable difference. And so you're not really actually trying to get to 0. You're just trying to get like to a manageable threshold. And so cannabis can be really great for that. And studies have shown that it's good for reducing opioid use and dependence. And that if you're using cannabis in conjunction with opioids, you end up using fewer opioids, which is useful because a lot of folks I've talked to who are using opiates in various capacities for pain relief share that, erections, orgasms, being present in their bodies is really challenging when you're using opiates. And so that's such a helpful thing. And then, of course, for trauma, I can speak from my own experience, like having pain with penetration most of my life and then using a cannabis topical genitally and having that not be the case anymore was a game changer. Or when I'm feeling really stressed and stuck in my head and like the world is hard, having something to really take the edge off so that I can turn off those like screaming voices and like dull them to a quiet whisper maybe so I can like really connect with my partner makes such a difference in the world.
And you actually even have on Leafly how to make a DIY marijuana lube.
Yes.
You can do it at home, huh?
You absolutely can. I sat down with my good friend Lauren Gibbs, who's a social media strategy genius and also grows her own plants at home, and she gave me her recipe and it's great. So all you need is a crock pot and some mason jars. Or if you have a little bit of cash to spend, I actually just got an automatic infuser called a Levo oil infuser, Levo. They're amazing. They're like $250, but beautiful. And you can infuse any oil with any plant matter. So it doesn't have to be cannabis. It can be. That's certainly what I'm going to be using it for mostly. But it's also like if I wanted to make basil infused olive oil, I could do that as well. They have like an herb chamber and then they infuse it. And then there's like a digital readout so you can set the temperature that you want to heat the oil at. And it's really great. Technology.
Yeah, it is a brave new world. Do you see that as well in an overlap in cannabis technology and lovemaking technology?
Oh my goodness, yes. There are such interesting parallels between the adult industry and the cannabis industry, both in like technology, in the troubles that they face as industries from payment processors and censorship and having to avoid like marketing to kids and all of those kinds of things. But especially on the tech side, like the ways in which we're using technology to enrich the experience are really cool. Like I have sex toys that I can control with a Bluetooth app that I can give up control to my partner who can control it from across the country, which is really neat. And then I have an app on my phone that controls my vaporizer. I have a Firefly 2, and I can set the temperature at which I would like to vape my flower, or I can switch to concentrates, and they have a concentrate setting. The world is just a magical place.
And what would be your advice to young people listening who want to learn more about being a cannasexual and combining sex and cannabis?
I would say do your research. I've published 120 plus articles on sex and cannabis, so there's lots of material out there. Consult experts. There are a lot of people who are sharing their experiences. My experience as a cisgender white woman who is, pansexual is going to be different than a person of color or a trans person or like. So find someone who resonates with you and your experiences and follow them and see what they're up to. And really just like experiment in ways that feel safe and good to you and keep track of things.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing about this great intersection.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Potbird Story by Lenore Kendall. Waking Half-waking mouth, open eyes shut, and legs grabbing at each other with breath subsiding as the juices dry our eyelids, flicker up. We reach beside the bed for the artful joint, so wisely placed the night before, and sip with tender mouths, still cradled in each other's flesh. When suddenly at once, eyes gently peering to the window left, we see the flash of yellow birds swarm the trees like locusts, hopping claw-footed over green leaf waysides. Soft bird-shaped birds as never seen before, their egg and butter-winging bodies and silver heads, and pure surprise. What are they? Half wondering if you see them too, and small relief as you whisper in my ear. Potbirds, you say. I don't believe you. I answer, sure of your truth as I deny it. What color are they? Yellow, you tell me, and what can I say to that? So yellow they are. Yellower than anything I've ever known. And so you see them too, and both of us so sweetly high. And are you all right after all, potbirds? And we sit there warm in bed and watching. They only show up when you're high. One right there, 2 over there, and 20 and 10 and yellow, each more bird than bird has ever been, and dance the tree into yellow bird heaven until suddenly all gone, and we arise at noon washing our face with soft water from a leaky tap, each morning waking them with one eye turned towards birds and never finding only empty green and tarnished trees, and waking them with love and coffee, but neither pot nor birds, nor quite convinced of their alliance, but wondering and mourning, sitting over breakfast smoking thin cigarettes for lunch, gave quick look at window, and they were back. A revelation of angels swarming the trees with yellow feathers, wings, the pretty birds leaping limb to limb. Potbirds, you smiled. I nodded and sat there watching the abundance of yellow, with the smoke drifting through the interstices of my long, long bones. Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott, and I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.